when I have been with some indigenous groups, and especially again if I'm taking some part in a ritual where they may use some substance, I see things in a very, very different way. I mean, I'm still seeing the world, but I'm seeing it in a very much more vivid way.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes when I've been in a more meditative state, not in a classical meditation, but perhaps walking, and I get a sense of perceiving things slightly more richly and deeply.
Yeah.
Do you think that that these are things that are always there, except that we are filtering them out in some way, as Huxley said, or as...
well, what is there? I mean, there's obviously, apart from saying there is something there, which is not generated by me, we can't know, obviously, what it is without getting into the picture. By the fact of knowing it, we know it only as we know it, so we can't know what it's like when we don't know it. It's like trying to look at what you look like when nobody's looking at you.
But we are aware that there are senses are only receiving within a bandwidth, for example, of light, of sensation in many different ways, and there are some ways that are travelling straight through us, and we don't think that we're actually picking up on them at all, and yet at the same time, perhaps in some intuitive way, or we call it intuitive, but in some extrasensory way, we are actually experiencing information through our stomach that we don't think we have any senses, but we are. All of these things could be a part of how we're living in the world.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And for example, when one's depressed, which is something I have experience of, it is actually the case that the world looks drained of colour. Yeah. And when you recover from depression, one of the things that people describe, and I've felt it myself, is the colour comes back. Now, how do you explain that? And what is actually happening? I mean, of course, it's not true that when you're depressed you can't discriminate. If you were asked, is this green or is it red? But the whole perception is different. And people in different cultures do perceive things differently. We know this, for example, from some interesting research done on differences between Far Eastern peoples and Westerners, on how they actually literally perceive a picture. So what do they report having seen? And there are consistent differences. The Westerners tend to focus on a prominent feature and ignore the ground, if you like. The figure stands out very much from the ground. They don't notice the ground or recognize the ground, compared with Far Easterners, Chinese, Korean and Japanese people, who tend to see more that feature within the context of the background. So they'll report more of that and be less impressed by the thing that we had focused on. So they're actually perceiving things differently, clearly. It doesn't mean to say that they're physically incapable of seeing something. I'm talking about attention.
Yes.
It's like attentional blindness. It's not that you literally your eyes don't pick it up or you're literally blind to it. It's all going in there somewhere. But you're not attending to it. It's about attention. It's all about what you attend to, how you attend. If you attend differently, you see the world differently. And the single biggest difference between the two hemispheres is their mode of attention. People think that when I'm saying that we're beginning to lose the capacity to understand the world, to attend to the world in the way the right hemisphere does, they think I'm just talking in some metaphor that has nothing to do with what's actually happening in the brain. But I was talking in Toronto a year ago, and after I'd talked, a woman came up to the microphone and she said, I teach 5 to 7-year-olds, and what my colleagues and I have noticed in the last few years is that we're actually having to start to teach children how to read the human face. Now, I was shocked. I don't know how you feel about that, but if it's come to the point where we actually need explicitly to teach people about something so intuitive and implicit as how to understand a face, we are changing what it means to be a human being, because that is at the core. And until recently, the only children that would have to have been taught would have been quite severely autistic children. Put that together with emails I've received from teachers all over the world who don't know one another, but a frequent email I've had has been from a teacher saying, I wonder if this is of relevance. Over the last few years, I've noticed something I've been giving my class for 30 years, and I can only remember one person who couldn't do it. The last few years, I'm finding that 30 to 40% of the class can't do it. What is it? It's a task of sustained attention. And if you put that together with research that suggests that children are less empathic now than they used to be, you've got three things that if you wanted to characterize very briefly and sketchily a difference, classic difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. What is the right hemisphere classically better at? Sustaining attention, reading faces, and empathy. So it seems that we are switching those things off. Now in the societies you've been to, I would imagine there are practices that are to do with sustaining attention, and that the reading of faces and body language is as important as any kind of verbalizing, and that empathy is a very important part of how a community works. Now, I don't mean to say that that means that all their practices would be practices that we would think of as kind and tolerant in an 18th century sort of a way, as the Enlightenment would see it. Very likely some of them are not. But that is different from a sense of empathy, and an empathy with one another and with the world, with nature, with what is around us. You know, how extraordinary that we now think of ourselves as separate from nature. You know, nature is something out there, we are here, but we are as much an excrescence of nature as a plant or an animal or anything else. And I would go further than that and say we're part of the whole thing, including the mountains and the rivers and the seas.
I had the great privilege of meeting a group of people in Colombia called the Kogi. They train their leaders in complete darkness for the first
17 years or something.
18 years of their life.
18 years.
They do it in periods of 9 and in honour of female gestation period of 9 months.
Right.
So they were allowing the possibility of me coming to meet them and to make a film with them, perhaps even during the course of this journey if I'm lucky enough. But they, as I was leaving, they said, and I said to them, what should I do to prepare for best coming to be in your presence? And they said, oh, give up sex, give up drugs, give up alcohol, give up all of your addictions and all of your distractions, and then maybe you will be able to understand our world a little bit better. I really wanted to come, so I said I would try, and I found that an incredibly difficult path to be on, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But one other thing that was really interesting at that time was that as I was leaving, someone said to me, you know that they're going to be watching you, don't you? You know that because these people living in the dark are tapping into this, what they believe to be the field of consciousness, because they are so expert at it, they're going to be influencing and part of, co-creating with this universal field, your path to come to see them or not now. And I was like, well, that doesn't fit with any way that I see the world. That's crazy, frankly, and it doesn't fit with anything that from my experiences to date have any sense.
No.
And so I came back, and sure enough, I broke a couple of the rules in no time. And as every time I accidentally broke one of the rules, something happened that my process of going to meet them got further and further away. So much so that it felt like that it really stopped me in my tracks. And I thought to myself, wow, how arrogant that I haven't even taken into account at all the possibility that what they said might be real, that actually they are in some ways watching me, and I am in some ways co-creating with them the ability for me to come and see them later. And so I allowed that in, and then suddenly my whole world changed, and basically magic arrived, and I started seeing meaning in everything. Every single thing that happened to me felt serendipitous and beautiful, and doors opening, and there was joy in my heart, and it was a very, very, very special time. And yet, every time I every time I was wallowing in this extraordinary beauty of this world that I had discovered by finding meaning in everything, I suddenly got worried that I was alienating myself from my friends who thought I'd gone a bit crazy. And also, I also wanted to kind of rationalize it. I wanted to figure it out, and whether or not there was anything, was this really magical or was it just coincidental, and I was applying magic to it.
One should keep a reasonably open mind, but not an open mind to just any old thing. But there are more things in heaven and earth than we know of, and I don't think that we know by any means. I think it would be stupid to suggest we know everything about what our brains are capable of, or everything that consciousness gives us. And one very commonsensical way of thinking about that is that we know very well, and this is extremely down-to-earth stuff, that if you are not expecting to see something, you won't see it, and you know that. And there are wonderful, vivid demonstrations of this. The most famous one probably is gorillas in our midst, which you must know about. But if you're not expecting something, you can miss the most blatant thing that's happening because it's not part of your lot to be looking for that. Also, if we don't normally formulate things in certain ways, we've got a preconception about what's going to happen, then we formulate everything that comes along according to the way we've preconceived. So while, on the whole, it's terribly important to stick to, because otherwise what are our bearings, to stick to reasonable bases for judging phenomena which are in keeping with other things we know, and there's a coherent, in other words, body of knowledge. It shouldn't be so fossilized that we rule out that we may be missing something. So one has to do, as always in life, a finessing act of keeping somewhere between a closed mind and a too open mind. That's all I would say about it. And if it is true that by not attending to things you lose the habit of seeing them, not expecting things, you simply don't notice them. When some peoples say that they hear things or see things that we just say, well, I can't, one explanation may be that because they have not ruled these things out and been made to rule them out by their culture, they actually are seeing and hearing things we don't. I mean, it's perfectly possible. Another possibility is that they're expressing themselves in a way which is figurative and we're perhaps taking it literally. But then even what figurative means and what literal means is an interesting, because that may be a distinction that we've got over clear in the West. It is possible to too sharply demarcate things. One should be as clear about things as the data permit, and no clearer, in my view. So clarity is a wonderful thing, but clarity to a sort of false clarity that, oh yes, we've got that one now, is an illusion. The belief that we can see things clearly can itself be a dangerous illusion. You see, there is actually no such thing as seeing something clearly. It was a point Ruskin made, actually, rather brilliant point. If you are half a mile away, a quarter of a mile away, you can't tell whether that white square on a lawn is an open book or a handkerchief. As you get closer, you see it's a book, but you don't know what the book is. As you get closer still, you see what the book is, and you may be able to read it. But then, have you seen the book clearly? If you look closer, you will see that what you think are letters are actually discontinuous splodges on a piece of texture that has hills and vales in it. And if you take a microscope to it, you'll see that there are little fibrils on it. And if Ruskin had had an electron microscope, he might have found that it was composed of largely nothing at all. Now, at which level of closeness and conciseness and precision is it that one sees the book clearly? You tell me. What does it mean? When we say we see that book clearly, what one means is I see clearly that it is a book. So it's not clarity is not an aspect of perception, it's an aspect of our thinking, our pigeonholing. Oh yes, it's clearly one of those. Now, if we are going to deal with things that we haven't yet got a pigeonhole for, shoving them into a pigeonhole prematurely, although it is neat and therefore clear and precise in that sense, may do travesty to what it is. Some things are inherently not susceptible to neat pigeonholing, and the attempt to neatly pigeonhole them may destroy them, make them no longer available for inspection. That's not a plea for woolly-mindedness. It's not a plea for stopping being as precise as one can be. It's not, above all, a plea for talking in sloppy terms. I am a great fan of being clear and being analytic where it is appropriate to be analytic. But sometimes it is not appropriate. Sometimes you will not achieve better understanding by simply going on doing more of that. You need to mix it with something else. Now that is what that analytic belief that we have it clear is what one bit of our brain is telling us, the articulate part is telling us that. And there are lots of voices in our culture that reinforce that. And it is a partial truth. I'm not saying it's false, it is a partial truth.